completed her doctorate in clinical psychology at Stony Brook University, and she will soon begin a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Institutes of Health, so NIH. Daneele is a distinguished scholar, not only by her exceptional academic dedication, which you will all learn more about today, but also by her profound commitment to community-engaged research. Her work has really delved deep into the complexities of urban neighborhood environments and their impact on parenting, establishing her as a real rising thought leader in the realm of developmental psychology. Daneele's journey intertwined with mine, actually, through our shared passion for transformative community work in our hometown of Ocean Hill, Brownsville, Brooklyn. At Power of Two, which is an organization committed to nurturing the relationship between parents and children to foster healthy development and support healing from systemic and generational trauma, Daneele and I work closely together, and in partnership with my esteemed friend, co-founder and colleague, Dr. Kristen Bernard, we spearheaded initiatives that integrated evidence-based and community-created strategies into programming, really enhancing parenting support in communities with a really beautiful history of cohesion and also a long history of marginalization. And so Daneele's insightful research was pivotal in shaping our engagement philosophy with families, ensuring that these insights translated into tangible, long-lasting outcomes for our Ocean Hill Brownsville community. I will say that our collaboration, two Caribbean women, y'all, from the resilient heart of Brownsville, I believe is an example of the successful fusion of representation, of research, of community voice, and practical real-time application. I really do believe that I mean, it's just been a really incredible experience. And I am so deeply grateful to Daneele. Thank you for your unwavering commitment, for your focus on centering our communities, for your effort to make your research accessible to everyone, and your dedication to fostering a positive developmental environment for all children. So really grateful to you, and you deserve all the accolades for what you've achieved and all the blessings for all the things that you're going to achieve and what you're going to help our communities do. So thank you. So I invite you all to please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Daneele Thorpe. Yay, Daneele.
Yes, thank you all so much for joining, and all the celebration that's happening really does well for the ego. Okay, so without further ado, I will share my screen. And as mentioned, even though there is part 1 and part 2, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat in case there are any questions. As Grant mentioned, unmute, the raise hand function, type it in the chat, whatever feels comfortable for you. So I'm also happy to take questions throughout. We want to make this as interactive and engaging and relevant and applicable as possible. Okay. So I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So as mentioned, a lot of my work centers around the science of neighborhoods, in particular how it influences early child development. And as Erasma highlighted, a lot of my work is intertwined with the different identities that I hold, being a part of these different communities and leveraging those identities to foster child well-being. So this kind of centers the title of my talk here today. So I'll be taking you through just a journey, starting with my identity, positionality in this research, how this started at Franklin and Marshall College, the work that I've done at Stony Brook, and eventually the work that I hope to do on a broad policy level. So, as mentioned, we all come with different identities, different parts of who we are. And it's important to remember that that is always reflected in the work that we do. Different identities may become salient at different times throughout our career and who we're interacting with, and just wanting to highlight some of these from upfront, being a Black woman, being an immigrant, so not born in this country, being the first to even graduate high school, and what an accomplishment that was for my family, and also understanding some of those other identities that hold a lot of power and privilege, such as being able to go to school, obtaining a PhD, and how that is also important to consider in the work that I do in community. So being mindful of how I balance these identities. So with that, we wanted to invite you to begin to reflect on some of these identities because it affects how you might perceive this presentation, what you might do with this presentation, the ultimate impact that it might have. So again, asking you to reflect on some of your own identities, as well as maybe highlight some of those identities that are more salient to you. And we'll have about 2 minutes for this. You can unmute, raise hand, type it in the chat. Any identities that are coming to mind for folks?
I see Erasmus in the chat, and maybe I'll be one of the brave folks that comes off of mute today, looking at the rest of y'all too, though. Because I'm looking at some of the identities that came up in my journal were a Black male, a social entrepreneur, a son, a brother, a peacemaker, and a tree lover. I think are some of the identities that are most important or salient to me today, and some of the identities that I hold.
Yeah, we have lots going. Yeah. And that mother's a big one for me. First to get a doctoral degree. Yeah, and all identities that are so important, and definitely influence the way that we navigate the world. Yeah. And I love that, the identities that are being shared in the chat take on multiple dimensions. So background, your relation to others. It's really important to be mindful of all those things and how they can be present, and be a strength in the different places that we occupy. So keep moving ahead. And again, if there are questions or if others want to continue sharing those identities and they might change throughout where some other identities that are salient comes up for you, feel free to keep sharing it in the chat. So as I mentioned, these identities, to me in particular, are important because they have influenced the way that I've navigated my science. And I'll point out just a few ways here, and at the end we'll go into it a little bit more after presenting some of these findings. So it's been important for me to recognize, again, balancing identity and science and the different identities I hold, both ones that have histories of marginalization and those that also have histories of power and privilege, and understanding how, even though I'm from these communities, I may not reflect everyone's experiences, be mindful not to impart my own experiences on others, and really centering the voices and lived experience of experiences of parents and children in the communities that I work with, understanding perceptions and unknown identities. How am I perceived? Am I perceived as student coming in, the researcher coming in, or am I perceived as being part of these communities that I'm from? Understanding how identities can change over time. And importantly, how to take all of these experiences and continue to ensure that there's community collaboration, partnership in science and in the research that I do. So as I mentioned, college was where my interest in science really began. And that was through the Posse Foundation Leadership Scholarship. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the Posse Foundation, but they really do a lot of excellent work for students in urban communities in terms of providing full tuition scholarships to go to college, because otherwise, don't know how that would have worked out. So really grateful to them and the work that they continue to do in communities. And I think an important part of their mission is this idea of a posse. So they send students to college in groups. And these are sending students that are from historically under-resourced backgrounds, backgrounds of color, into a lot of private white institutions. So sending them with a group of people to support them transitioning to that space. But here, there's been a lot of involvement in research, and for that, I thank Dr. Ryan Lacey, who really kind of got me started in this love of science and investigation and what it means to be a researcher. And then these slides are just going. Mentorship, I think that was another big piece of my coming to term as a scientist and practitioner in college is the role of mentorship and representation. As I mentioned, the school that I went to was a private white institution. So PWI, which means that there weren't a lot of students and peers that looked like me, and there weren't a lot of professors that looked like me. And among the few professors of color, there was one Black psychologist in the psychology department. He's a trained clinical psychologist, and a lot of his work focused on understanding community trauma. So he worked a lot with the United Nations in going into countries that have been affected by things like genocide and community violence, and really thinking about how to rebuild the community, not just brick by brick, but also ensuring the community is built back with strength and empowerment after community trauma has occurred. He was what inspired me to want to become a clinical psychologist. So again, that mentorship was so pivotal and so instrumental in my career and my love of science and what I do with understanding the role of community and impact and how to use strength-based approaches to support communities. So we'll do another pause, reflect, and share again, where I would love for you all to just take a second to think about who influenced you, whether that be your current job, your role. Maybe we have quite a few mothers in the chat. That could also be, someone who influenced you to be the mother that you are, the entrepreneur that you are. So we would love to hear a little bit more about that, and maybe how, on the same light, maybe how important was representation in that journey for you. So either of these questions, however you feel that it reflects more with you or resonates more with you, we'd love to hear.
I'm gonna be brave and try to come off mute. Daneele, there's a person named Naoko Kudo who was a former supervisor, mentor, etc. But I think there is a way in which she approached her work with empathy, practicalness, and like sure-footedness around the impact that she wanted to have for her community, as well as like for her team and for the people that she loved. And I just think her approach to work has been so foundational for me, and also to see an Asian American woman be able to like stand in that balance between fully embracing who she was and also not like standing in a version of leadership that I didn't get to see very often. So it was really powerful to me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And we also have some a response in the chat. Being the child of a public school teachers has a huge influence on my passion for education. Yeah, so it's really important to just take some time to reflect on how these different experiences and these different role models and mentors can influence the work that we do, especially at times when there are systemic barriers that have you question if what you're doing is right or is sustainable, really remembering some of those influences and paying tribute and homage to that. So then my journey into science continued at Stony Brook University. So I began a clinical psychology PhD program after completing undergrad at Franklin and Marshall. And as Erasma mentioned, my work was with Dr. Kristen Bernard, and something that really drew me to her was a lot of what Erasma mentioned around community partnership and collaborative research. So this was scientists doing work in the communities where I spent part of my childhood and was so passionate about finding ways to support sustainable change. So through that lab and through the partnership with Power of Two was so instrumental. There was the Stony Brook I went to, which looked a certain way. Again, you know, being a scholar of color in a community and an environment that does not always look like you, and then being able to have that partnership with Power of Two and attend community events where, you know, there was a lot more connection. There was a lot more, okay, I understand why I do the work that I do, was definitely helpful throughout. And having that support from Kristen and thinking about in grad school, there's a lot of push to financially support yourself. And it's can be so difficult in doing science that intersects so much with your identity, because it's a constant battle of having to prove to other people who are not from your neighborhoods about why you're doing the work that you're doing, and how balancing that has also been definitely a learning point. And again, mentorship and scholarship, both at Stony Brook and reaching out to other scholars, and having, you know, the team at Power of Two being involved in some of that work, and just seeing the community work on the ground. So not just reading about it from journals and hearing about it in a classroom, but seeing real life representation of what community partnered research looks like and what being on the ground facilitating change looks like. So that led me to discovering my science. And I hope this is clear from the devices that you're on, but I see that some folks are joining from their phones. So this is just a theory that really highlights that a child does not exist in a vacuum, especially you know, communities of color. There are all these different factors at every different systems. So not just their parents, but their communities as well. And I think that was one of something that was really instrumental to me in my work with Kristen. Again, there's also that dynamic of I'm a scholar of color coming in to a lab that has been historically white, and really, shaping and understanding that, there's parenting and how parenting affects child development. And can we also think about the neighborhood environment, because parents are also operating in these different systems and wanting to be really mindful about how these systems in turn influence parenting and child development. So that led me to doing a lot of the research that I do, and I'll present some findings from that. And again, if there are questions, please feel free to unmute. I'm also monitoring the chat, happy to answer or clarify, or listen to any reflections that are coming up as I present these findings as well. So I recently published a meta-analysis, which is essentially looking at, great diagram, looking at the association between exposure to community violence in parenting. And this is across the globe. An overwhelming majority of the research was done in the United States, but also considering that this can be a global concern, especially in regions that have a history of civil conflict or community violence. So you can see some of the countries that were reflected here in that study. So this was specifically, again, looking at the relationship between exposure to community violence, different aspects of parenting. So the warm, sensitive parenting, what is considered harsh parenting, the parent-child relationship, and parents' control of children's behavior. So a lot of supervision, you can't go here, I need to know who you're with. What we found was that greater exposure to community violence was associated with lower positive parenting, an increase in those stricter parenting practices, lower quality parent-child relationship, and lower control of child behavior, so less supervision and monitoring and limit setting. What was really interesting about these findings in particular is that relationship between exposure to community violence and harsh parenting, there were these interesting things that came up regarding child sex and race. So specifically, parents were more likely to use harsh parenting practices for their female children compared in neighborhoods with more violence compared to their male children. And we also saw this pattern for older children as well. So parents were reacting in these ways when children were older. And we can, think about why some of that is happening just in terms of parents. As kids get older, they have a little bit more control over their community. But this led me to think about, what about young children? What about what's happening in early childhood? And we know that children are less independent in their environments, but they do interact with their environments, and really wanting to explore the ways that the neighborhood environment either directly impacts young children or impacts them via how it influences their parenting. So this was some findings from a recent study looking at kiddos in New York City between the ages of 3 to 5 and their parents. So we looked at different aspects of the neighborhood environment. So unemployment, socioeconomic status, social cohesion. So, people finding strength in their neighbors, rates of crime and policing, exposure to toxic waste sites. So we know a lot of waste sites are concentrated in historically under-resourced communities, access to green spaces, as well as parks and playgrounds. And what was interesting here is that we're seeing that in this young age, so these are kiddos between the ages of 3 and 5, we're seeing that in neighborhoods where there's more disadvantage, we're seeing that parents are responding in more supportive ways. So parents are more warm, they're more sensitive to their child's distress, and they were also responding in less unsupportive ways. So they're allowing their child to have more emotional expression. And these might be surprising based on the larger research, but also important to think about how parents are essentially responding in very adaptive ways, and how that can be leveraged to support parenting. Not that we're telling policymakers, it's okay, leave the communities the way they are, parents are doing great regardless, but just showing the strength of parents. And it was interesting to, again, this goes to thinking more about signs and uplifting the voices of parents. So we conducted focus groups with 30 parents. Again, these are parents of young children, primarily lower income, women of color. Focus groups were conducted in both English and Spanish. So we really wanted to understand how parents are describing their neighborhood environment, how they think their neighborhood environment affects their child, experiences of parenting in an urban neighborhood, the neighborhoods that they were raised, as well as structural changes that they feel politicians or community leaders can make to improve neighborhood conditions. And what we saw from these findings, and I'll present some of these and we'll have some time for discussion and sharing. So it was really interesting doing this work because, you know, parents understand what's happening in their community. They talked about things like gun violence, kids going missing, and responding in ways such as not taking my eyes off my kid when I leave the house. So parents are cognizant of some of the things that are happening in the neighborhood. They're cognizant of the structures of systemic racism and inequities that are present in the neighborhoods and the ways in which they're present. And this is influencing parents across different ways. They report being a lot more worried. Got to worry about your kids because anything can happen. But also responding in ways such as staying more in the home. So we have a lot of parents that talk about, we're going to stay inside. And when you think about a young child, it might be more difficult. We know the importance of children going outside, being at the parks and playgrounds, learning to interact with their peers. That's where they're building a lot of those foundational social skills, emotion regulation, learning to share, learning that you have to wait your turn on the slide and you can't just go first all the time. When parents are in their neighborhoods, we also see this social withdrawal, which I think for me was really difficult to hear because we know the importance of cohesiveness in neighborhoods. We know the importance of parents looking out for other parents' children if, you know, something is happening to ensure their safety, ensure their well-being. And parents kind of telling their kids, don't mind your business. You don't need to engage. And I actually had a parent say, you know, we need a village, but New York City doesn't feel like a village anymore, even though we need a village to raise a child. And just how centering that was to understand the importance of the social cohesiveness and how some of these things that are happening now are shifting that, and really thinking about how we can facilitate more social cohesion to support parents. And another important finding here was just socialization. So parents are talking about exposing their kids to some of the things that are happening in the neighborhood, not painting the pretty pictures, like being upfront with their child. Another important aspect was parents, and again, these are 3 to 5-year-old kiddos, parents teaching their kids to be strong, making sure they can stand up for themselves, making sure they can stand up for others. So really thinking about how, in context of the neighborhood and the environment, how parents are engaging in these different socialization practices to ensure the well-being of their child. So with that, we'll do another pause, reflect, and this time we will discuss. So we'll be going into breakout rooms. And we'd just love for you to take some time to reflect on your own experiences. So it could be questions around your neighborhood environment. What was that like? Whether it's your home environment, your neighborhood, what do you remember seeing, experiencing, smelling when you were growing up? If you felt like your parents adapted their parenting style based on the context you were in, and also any protective factors that you may have seen, extended family, multi-generational household, community organization, places of faith. What were some of those protective factors that you felt and experienced both at home and in the community? So we'll do that for about 10 minutes. We'd love maybe 7 minutes in the groups, and then would love to come back and maybe share for 3 minutes if folks would like to share some of the things they came up with in the groups.
Okay. Thank you, Daneele. I'll open these rooms now.
Well, no.
I feel like we did not have a lot of time.
Oh my gosh.
7 minutes, Daneele, I don't know.
Hmm.
I was out here though.
Oh, we didn't finish. Okay, are we in the group again? I'm on a phone, so I can't see.
We're back here.
Yeah, we're back in the main room.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
So we have a few minutes if folks would like to share some of what they spoke about. If you didn't have a chance to share, would love to hear from you now.
I think one of the things that we shared was urban versus suburban or rural neighborhoods. So parenting is very different in cities. I come from a city which is a political, it's a political city, political seat, like in New Delhi, India. And there's more crime, there is less safety, more traffic on the streets, and parents are more protective towards their children. So their styles are strict, their kids are not allowed to venture out, versus rural or more suburban neighborhoods where parents feel more confident sending their children out, and they interact more with the neighbors, play more, have more free time. So I think there's a big difference in parenting styles affected by the kind of setting, rural or urban. That's one thing that came out in our group.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
I think what struck me from listening to my fellow group people, partners, is that they felt safe and they felt a sense of neighborhood, and like how other people viewed the neighborhood looking from the outside in, and like what that gaze and then the narrative and the language from others being put upon them, you know, how that could make one feel, or just their observations about that. So that really struck me. And I didn't get to share sort of the experience, but I'm really glad that person mentioned about urban versus rural. Like, I think what was interesting for me, both growing up in Jamaica and in East New York, is how neighborhoods were very neighborhoody in both urban and rural places. And so, like, if someone was getting a spanking or something and the neighbor would intervene, like that would happen in urban and rural areas, you know, like sort of this sense of protecting and, you know, like, all right, you know, what was the expression? We had this funny, like, they would beg for you. That's it. I couldn't remember. They would beg for you, you know, so that you wouldn't get in trouble, you know. So I remember things like that, you know, that were really wonderful. And like just being able to run up and down the street, even in a place that was considered very violent and there was a lot of political violence in the heart of Kingston. But like we could run down the store. Like I remember being 4 or 5 years old, run down the street, go get this and come back. And they would stand up the top and look. But like once they knew you could do it and everybody knew this is child and all right, you know, so just there was a sense of like, we're all watching out for other people's children, despite what was being said. And I would know, same as Erasma and Portia said, like when I would go to other places in Jamaica and then also here in America, like, oh, you come from Kingston, oh, you come from the ghetto, and just what other people's, you know, thoughts about that were and how that could affect you and affects the community. But we had strong community because people did have to look out for each other, especially mothers with the children.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh,
Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
oh, Colleen, you're just making me think so much about the pieces around social cohesion also just have to do with like building deep relationship. There's I lived in Northwest Pasadena, which has like a good amount of violence in the area and like two sort of rivaling gangs that exist there. And it was so transformational when I started actually getting to know my neighbors. And it didn't matter, like, as you actually get to know your neighbors, there is a shift and a change that happens in like my perception of the neighborhood and also like what is happening around me, and that notion of being able to walk down the street and say hello and actually recognize who folks are, like it just has, it really changed my experience when I lived in that part of town, and also what it meant for me to feel cared for, like when instances would happen in the neighborhood where like things might be more triggering in that season, like folks would come by and share like, hey, today might be a good day to like stay in your house, but like you would get the warning about, right? Like, and there's like a form of community care in that I think is, I don't know, that gets to a little bit of what you're talking about and like helps build that social cohesion that I think breaks down some of the isolation that otherwise you might feel as a parent.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and definitely something good to potentially keep in mind as we transition into now part 2. And again, we'll break again just like this for more discussion. Also, so happy to hear that folks were able to share and some of these questions really resonated with everyone, or allowed you to take a step back and reflect. So now we'll transition a little bit to talking about the science of neighborhood and child development. So we spoke a little bit about parenting and would just like to spend some time about how we see this direct relationship between the neighborhood and child development. So I'll spend some time talking about some findings on the effects of these neighborhoods on things like body mass index. So what our children eat, how it affects their weight gain, body fat, pubertal development, also their emotion regulation, as well as school performance. So we'll start with body mass index. We know that the environment where we live affects what we eat, what we have access to, parks and playgrounds that may encourage more physical activity among young children, having access to healthy fruits, vegetables. And what we saw from these findings, again, this was a young sample of 3 to 5-year-old kiddos, was that we see a greater representation of kids being underweight in the obese category among Black children. So that's represented here by the black bars versus our white kiddos, where we're seeing a lot more kiddos in the healthy weight category, but lower in the underweight and obese category. And just to highlight that, on the surface level, these may seem like racial differences, but really want to highlight the role of neighborhood. And we know that in historically under-resourced neighborhoods in communities of color, we see even if we have fruits and vegetables, it looks different. It may not be as fresh. Thinking about exposure to toxic chemicals, exposure to parks, having access to quality parks and playgrounds is really important for child development and really important for what our children eat. So we also see here that in communities where we see higher rates of this disadvantage, that there are higher rates of kiddos who are also more obese and also underweight. So we also have to think about both ends of the spectrum, where nutrition is important for both kiddos who are underweight and kiddos who are obese. So another finding that I wanted to highlight was the role of neighborhood on pubertal development. And what's interesting here is that based on this research project, and this looked at kiddos as young as 9, and what we're seeing by this orange line here, for folks who are on the phone, definitely do my best to explain, but what we're seeing is that while all girls eventually reach puberty by age 15, we're seeing a higher start among girls specifically, so not boys, but only girls in historically under-resourced communities, where even at age 9, we're seeing higher kind of Tanner scale development. So that's thinking about body changes, pubic hair, menstruation is happening a lot sooner in communities that are more under-resourced. And I think this has a lot of bigger sociocultural implications, especially when you think about girls from under-resourced communities, Black and Latina girls who are often adultified from a younger age, and what this means in context of how they're perceived, expectations that are placed, and how that has other implications on self-esteem and development. So really thinking about how, neighborhoods have these far-reaching effects even on how our children develop across the lifespan. And also thinking about too, again, we know the research on what children are eating, what the concentration of toxic chemicals in under-resourced neighborhoods, and how that might influence hormonal development. So another important category that I also investigate is the role of neighborhoods on children's socio-emotional development. As we talked about, kiddos, they have so much energy. I have a younger brother, and he's 9 now, but I can't keep up. They will go to the park and play for hours, and you are begging them to go home. So we know how important that is for a child's development in terms of learning early social skills. Again, we talked about how to take turns, how to play with rules in different games, how to collaborate with others, And it's really, thinking about that social cohesion that others have mentioned, that's really building that from a young age. That's the social cohesion. You may not even know the child's name, but oh, when I come to the park on Sunday evenings at 3 o'clock, I know that these 5 kids will be there, and that's the group that I play tag with, and how important that is at that age. And we see that in neighborhoods where there's more disadvantage. We're seeing higher rates of kids who are more anxious. So thinking about how hard it is to maybe find friends once you're put it in a kindergarten setting or a more structured setting when you haven't had that example. We also see things like greater outbursts, greater aggression. Again, thinking about fine-grained things like taking turns. That's something that kids learn at playgrounds or interacting with other kiddos, and how important that is for their mental health. And we can also think about the other stressors that even come with communities. So a final area before we jump into our groups is thinking about the effect on academic development. So this was some work that I did with another Black scholar at Yale University, looking at Paterson, New Jersey. Folks are familiar with Paterson, New Jersey. It's also another area that has just been a lot of historic disenfranchisement, cutting of funding. And it's difficult to see here, but for folks that are on the phone, we see a lot of concentrated community disadvantage in areas like Paterson, New Jersey, which is resulting in what we see higher absenteeism. So kids are going to school less. And this is highest among kindergartners, so a very young age. And we know that there are already such systemic disparities and achievement gaps. And when kids aren't going to school from such a young age, that just expands that gap as they continue throughout childhood. And that is exactly what we see where our youth in Paterson, so this is 3rd grade when they start taking those standardized tests that everyone hates. We're seeing lower mathematics scores, lower English scores. And we know that there are definitely issues in terms of racial bias with, standardized testing, and also acknowledging that how the communities kind of perpetrate some of these systemic inequalities, and thinking about access to schools. We know that what kids are eating are important for their cognitive development. We know that if kids have access to playing, that helps their emotional development. We know that the extracurricular resources that exist in a school also have important implications. So really thinking about how the neighborhood environment is important for all these different aspects of child well-being. So we'll take some time here to again pause and reflect. Yes.
Well, we had 2 questions come up earlier from Surinder. I don't know if you want to address these now or if you would prefer to wait until we come back from the group.
Maybe when we come back from group, because I think they're super relevant to some of those. So amazing foreshadowing. So we'd love to put you all in small groups again, thinking about if any of these findings were surprising. So thinking about BMI, pubertal development, academics, socio-emotional development, any findings that resonated with you, and what you think some of those implications are or opportunities for intervention. And again, we'll have about 10 minutes for that. Although I think last time we needed a lot more time, but we'll see how that goes. So we'll do breakouts again.
Are we okay to change the rooms, or y'all prefer to be in the same spaces? Any preferences?
Same places would be great. We develop relationships that way.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna consolidate Buckley and Surinder. I'm gonna move you in with Anna and Demetra, if that's okay. I'm gonna open these up. All right. Thanks, y'all.
believe we're all back. Hoping we all had very enriching conversations, and would love to hear if there were things mentioned in the group or things that you didn't get a chance to share. Would love to leave the space open for you to share or reflect.
I may be, sorry, I shared with my group I was feeling a bit sad. And that was just kind of where I was at. But like one of the things that had me excited was like all the folks in this space who are pointing the finger at the system and saying this is what's causing this, not at the family in our kids and our communities. And so I'm just curious, like, yeah, what are y'all doing? I'm just curious, what are y'all doing? Like, how do you feel like your work is impacting these dynamics that we're seeing play out?
So I'm going to try and get the reading app in the hands of the parents so that they can spend more time reading aloud with their children. Reading benefits behavior and attention. It's very important for kindergarten readiness. It helps improve the standardized test scores. So my light bulbs were like, okay, I need to go to Patterson to gather evidence on my app. So I think that's one thing that I was thinking about.
So I'll also share. I was really inspired by my group, and I've been thinking a lot about this around like, okay, and how can I get some resources to like I do this naturally, like creating like groups and community groups. And I'm like, like for some of it, you don't need money. It's like sort of carving out the time and setting the intention and making it happen. Because people do, like, it's part of our nature to naturally want to congregate. So what would that look like? So as I shared with the group, I have more questions and I'm more curious. And so how do we do that? I felt really inspired, and I hope they speak up because they just had wonderful things also to share and say about how it was resonating with them and what they'd like to see and do, or how they're like reframing all of this, like the challenge and the what the research is telling us in terms of opportunity and also the challenges.
So I was part of that group, the hype group. That's who we are. And one of the things that I was thinking about as we were all sharing was how Brownsville showed up and showed out during the pandemic. We were dying, y'all, like truly dying, and the level of social cohesion, like the community coming together, checking on neighbors, supporting children, figuring it out because the institutions, the government agencies just couldn't do it. And so how do we harness, and again, it's like what I mentioned in the group was our ability to tap into radical hope. And so how do we harness that, not only in moments of of difficulty, like real difficulty as something as big as the lockdown and the pandemic, but in this moment to really create a system within our community for us that is supportive, that is responsive, that is not adultifying, girls, that understand what's happening in their neighborhood, and we're saying no to that, and that it's recognizing that it's not us, that it's the system that is creating this. And so by celebrating ourselves, by lifting up our strengths, by really creating solidarity, we're pushing back on the system and really creating a community that is harnessing our power and our ability to care for ourselves, heal ourselves and our children.
It's amazing that you said that. Those were the exact same things that we talked about in our group. Different words, but same words. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we also talked about not just the adultification of the girls, but also young Black boys because of the way they are perceived and seen when they get to a certain size. And then education does the injustice around 3rd or 4th grade. We started losing them at that time. And, you know, society finally has started acknowledging that. So hopefully with that acknowledgement comes some movement behind that.
Yes.
Hey, Miss Portia.
Hi, everybody. You know, the other thing we shared was, I shared is I'm excited about the work that, the research and all that, but she never fails to talk about something positive. I'm so tired of negative research. We've been negative research to death. And what we've got to do is acknowledge that all of these things do have an impact on children's learning and development. However, we also have to stay in a space, in a mental space, to know that we have, as a community of folk, resources and the power and the commitment to also build and protect and support children in spite of all that is around them. That is not the end of the story, because look what we've done for 300 years. But we have to stay in that space. And I know when you're working on a day-to-day basis and you're there every day, it may be hard to stay in that space, but we are our own solution, and we have to work together. And there is resiliency, and there are things we can do in relationship with children and families that will build their capacity to grow and thrive even in the midst of all of this. We can do it. And I know we can. Anyway, I'm encouraged.
Yeah, that really resonated with, it seems like what others have talked about, and what we did in our group was really thinking about, you know, acknowledging that these systems are at fault and these systems were built in a way to sustain inequities.
Yes.
It really helps to remove some of that onus of responsibility. So, you know, we send kids, you're expected to learn, and there are factors that can make that difficult. So really removing the onus of responsibility on parents, on children, and putting that on a system. And in a similar vein, you know, working together against the system, you know, policy change, we don't know when that might come, but how can we make changes within ourselves? So, you know, as an example, for folks who are familiar with New York City, our mayor just slashed funding by 55 million to the parks department. We just spoke about how important neighborhoods and built neighborhood environment is, and really thinking, okay, system is working against us. How can we go out, make sure we schedule time to go to the parks? If we're cleaning up, we can teach a 7-year-old to clean up trash too, and do it with your friends, builds community. So really thinking about how the neighborhoods can then fight against those changes and those systemic level inequities that are happening. So there were two questions in the chat that I really want to make sure I get to, and if others have questions, would love to touch on that as well. So one is, how do I ensure my findings are accessible and useful? So one thing with academia, they will publish a paper and will make you pay. So sometimes I would need to pay to see something that I did. Ridiculous. So what I do is I create like infographics on Canva, shout out to Canva, that I would love to share with you all. It seems like I can't drop PDFs in the Zoom chat right now, but can definitely ask the host here to share some of that. So simple infographics, not with all the academic jargon and not 50 pages long because bore. So love infographics, has a lot of colors, a lot of to catch the attention of parents and leaders in the community, to be able to use those findings in a way, and sharing it back with community leaders and parents, like, this is what we're seeing. What do you think? Is this resonating? So that's one way I ensure that it is accessible. So that's part of, fighting back against the system. You tell me I can't share my work, I'll share it in other ways. And that's one thing that I think really resonated with a lot of the conversations that are happening here. And I would say surprising findings. I think it was really eye-opening for me, and really thinking about that, the paper looking at neighborhoods and how it impacts parents and how parents are responding in turn. We're seeing, there's always a negative perception of parents in lower income neighborhoods, parents in lower resource neighborhoods. And when we're looking at the data, we're seeing that they're responding in ways that are more sensitive. That's not to say other parents from higher income neighborhoods aren't sensitive, and parents are showing their strength, they're showing their resiliency towards their young kiddos, which is the age group that's really near and dear to my heart. But we're seeing that. So how can we ensure that neighborhood conditions are supporting that and not breaking that further or trying to? So we want parents to be resilient, and we want a system that supports parents.
All right, y'all. It is time. I don't want to go, but we gotta go. So I would love for us to come off mute. If anybody wants to share any specific gratitude with Daneele, please come off of mute. We can stick around for at least another minute to do that. But Daneele, I'm very much celebrating your contribution to this space, but your contribution to our community and into this field. And I celebrate you and your incredible work that you've begun to undertake, and just so excited to be in community with you going forward as well.
Thank you all. It's really, really nice to come together in these spaces, and really helps to bring the hope alive when you hear other folks in the field doing similar work. And I did write down your information, Miss Portia, so I'll definitely be in contact, and I'll ask the host of this meeting to share my contact information as well in those one-pagers and all the papers that I'm going to download and send to you all.
Hey.
Good. Thank you so much. Really, I'm so excited. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Thorpe, we'll talk to you soon. Thank you all. Take care. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, team, for bringing this to us.
Thank you.
Very, very wonderful. Very, very wonderful.
Ms. Portia, I just sent you a text. Check your text messages. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all. Daneele, thank you.
Daneele, that was awesome.
Everything.
90 minutes? I thought 90 minutes was long.